This is Gensh, and this is my Infernals audio log number 2. Now, the reason why I'm doing this today rather than waiting and doing whatever is because this is an important topic. This is not a new topic like the territory was. This is an old topic, but this is a very important topic, and I'm actually going to tell you what it is now. I'm going to talk about Shintai in this log. Because that is essentially the central focus of the Infernals splat. There's a lot to be said about Shintai. The main sticking point where I disagree with the writers is that Shintai should really be special. They should not be something that you put together like Legos, no matter how awesome Legos are, because that's not an infernal theme. That's a lunar theme, and that's an alchemical theme. It's not an infernals theme. One of the earliest drafts I had for this project actually described them as the chosen in bondage, rather than like, oh, well, we're the chosen of hell. No, they're the chosen in bondage because the sidereals might have their god bosses who are obnoxious, and this abyssals might have their death lords who are completely overbearing. They still don't have to. And while the abyssals really got the short end of the stick last edition, the big thing is that none of those bosses are nearly quite so large, both literally and figuratively, as the Yozis. And even though the Yozis are going to be, or just by their nature, they are somewhat impersonal, even if you're immediately dealing with one of their humanoid Jotun, they are the biggest bosses, they are the craziest bosses, except for the Neverborn, and you don't want to talk to the Neverborn anyway. So their fundamental theme is of restriction and of freedom. In particular, that the Primordials are beings that are essentially free, whereas the Yozis are beings that are essentially bound. And so it's, the Infernal Exalted aren't Yozis, though. They aren't bound. And in fact, they were the ones who were doing the binding 5,000 years ago. So it becomes then a play between, freedom and binding. Exactly where do the Infernals stand? So that's a major theme I would want to play with. And with the Shintai as being an avatar of a Yozi's Jotun, of course I would want to focus more on the binding aspect there. And so while I had said from the beginning, well, I'm going to have Shintai and I'm going to also have these sub-modules, except they're not going to be called sub-modules because you're not alchemicals. So you can upgrade your Shintai, you can personalize it somewhat, but, the core is locked down. You can't make Demon Emperor Shintai not radioactively poisonous. If you don't want to kill your subjects, there's a built-in method for that. They have to kneel before you. But, the poison is a fundamental aspect of it. And if you were able to go pick and choose among the Yozis and build your own personal Shintai, okay, that's great. And that's probably how you would build, say, a custom Shintai anyway. You just pick and choose the effects you want. The problem is that it doesn't support the theming. You could just go through and pick, whatever was mechanically the best, even though, I don't think the writers are going to make it that easy. I mean, but it's the idea of it, that possibility, and unless you're playing, the Infernal who will become the Titan of min-maxing, that's really not in theme. And that's kind of the Ebon Dragon's theme already anyway. And Autothons. And I don't know, maybe Gaia's. I think she cheated in a lot of ways. But the main concern then is just, okay, what is a Shintai if it's locked down? And how does that interact with you as a player wanting to have a certain amount of freedom? I think actually that in third and a half edition of D&D, the Binder core class in Tome of Magic actually did this fairly well. You made a pact with the vestige, and then if you failed your binding roll, you had to deal with this influence. And you know what? You could actually ignore the influence, but it gave you penalties to do so. So what I decided is that I would just take a closer look at the Shintai, and I would see how they are designed currently. Now, currently, what it is that there's 3 basic stages, and I'd actually listed them as stages. You've got, it's been described as a Pokemon thing. You've got your basic stage, your first evolution, your second evolution. So, what it is first of all, there's a buff, which is not labeled as a Shintai. You've got your first actual Shintai, which is, labeled as a Shintai, and then you've got your second Shintai, which in some cases is labeled as a greater Shintai, but generally speaking is labeled as some other Shintai, but just happens to have another Shintai as a prerequisite. Now, okay, that's great for the Pokemon evolutions, but how does that really deal with becoming an Infernal becoming a Primordial? How exactly does even if it's the Infernal just becoming one of the existing Yozis, how does that really work out? And it was clear enough with the Ebon Dragon's full write-up, but it wasn't really interesting is the problem. It was okay. Well, here's my +1. Here's my +1 flaming. Here's my +1 flaming burst. Okay, it's great that you can turn into a 50-mile-long dragon, but that's honestly kind of dull. It looks awesome, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't really grant you any capabilities that you didn't have before. So what I did is I've decided to divide Shintai into 3 different stages, which is what is already there. But okay, they're different stages, I swear. So first stage is Relic Shintai. Now with the Relic Shintai, you are taking on superficial aspects of the Yozis. You are wearing the Yozis. You are that berserker wearing that animal skin in order to acquire its strength. Now, the aspect of bondage here is simple. You've given up the freedom of choosing to wear a different relic. Now, that's not a big deal, but it does become more extreme as, the level goes on. Next level is the Effigy Shintai, where you are no longer just the berserker who's acquiring the ferocity. You are actually becoming this half-man, half-beast with claws and fur and all the good monster movie stuff. This is where all of the big, fancy Shintai in the current edition would be placed. You're not becoming the Demon City, you are becoming this Demon City made man. You have all the wit of a human and all the power of a Yozi. Now, the second stage Shintai are going to be just as powerful as the third stage Shintai, because this is where most people will stop. At this point, you've given up certain freedoms. You've given up the freedom of wearing a different relic. You've given up the freedom of course, assuming a different effigy. But you will also suffer certain behavioral restrictions while using an effigy Shintai, because honestly there was no reason to ever take off the heuristic logo Shintai. Seriously. And of course the third stage of Shintai, this is where you become the animal. You are now fully a piece of the Yozi. The Yozi is free in creation. You are the Yozi. Now, people aren't going to want to take the third stage Shintai, actually, because behavioral restriction going to get a little bit extreme. You are now Malfeas. You can't think except in terms of rage. Your memories are your own. Your desires are your own. But this hatred for everything is constantly raging in the back of your mind. Not to mention the fact that you don't have legs or arms anymore and you're a city. So, we'll see how that works out. That's kind of that's a restriction right there. Some of the others are going to be more mobile, but, with a Dorian, you can't stop running either, so. Now, I did already mention that I'm going to allow for any playstyle, including the Green Solars, so there's actually something special I'm doing for that, too. I mentioned that with first stage Shintai, you get the freedom you're giving up is the freedom to choose something else. Well, that's not entirely true. I am intending to include a certain charm which will allow you to use multiple relics, and maybe even allow you to use relics from other Yozis while wearing an effigy. However, this has a freedom cost too. By asserting to reality that you are a human, conqueror of all, bearer of the spoils of war from multiple primordials, you are also asserting that you're not a primordial, and so you lose the ability to become a primordial. You lose access to your third stage Shintais. Now, mind, I did say that the second stage is going to be just as powerful as the third. The third's going to have niche uses. You know, you can't get more, or you can't get better at producing armies than to become a whole city and produce them like that. But on the other hand, you know, you're kind of stuck there as a city. Whereas a human, you know, pick up and go. I've got all my relics. I can train people with these relics. You know, we're going to see where this takes us, and you're not quite so pinned down, because the freedom you've given up was the freedom of choosing to restrict your freedoms, and we're going to end up with some circular logic at some point.